All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to get started here right on time today. I want to welcome you all to our customer exclusive webinar, Cloudy with a Chance of Awesome, a security forecast for cloud computing. Today, we're going to focus on what gear you need, what risks you're inheriting, and what questions you should be asking when it comes to the cloud. Now, as always, we welcome questions. Please add them to the comments or to the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them often near the end of the presentation. If I see something as Reg is talking that warrants us kind of talking about it during the presentation, for sure we will do that. Also, please keep an eye out for our next customer exclusive webinar. That's going to be in May, Beyond Awareness, Advanced Tips for Securing Your Humans. Finally, for customers that are local to the Albany area, you may have seen us talk about this so far. We hope you'll join us for an Albany Firewolves lacrosse game on March 22nd. If you have questions or interested, please reach out to me and we will make sure you can join us. With that, welcome everybody that continues to come in. I want to introduce our presenter, someone who simultaneously has his head in the clouds in the best possible way and his feet firmly planted on the ground. Reg.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, I guess you kind of hit it on the head. Not a cloudy day today, so maybe this will be a brighter presentation than I had originally anticipated. It's okay. It's all customers here. We're all friends. I've met most of you. And so you kind of know the story. So we're going to kind of skip the introduction here and get right into some survey questions. Because while we're really pretty intimate with the technical architecture infrastructure for most of you, sort of curious about a few things in general. And so I'm going to hand this to Dana. First question, let's just jump in. So first question, are you currently using cloud services for critical business functions, right? So I guess email qualifies, but we're kind of looking for more like your ERP system or managing intellectual property, or what's another good example here? Maybe designing, manufacturing components, things like that. Well, so far, everyone. Okay, so we got a few that are on premises, but the vast majority are in the cloud. So exciting. And, OrbitalFire, we are not unlike you, honestly. A vast majority of our business is cloud-based, cloud-centric, at least. I've heard the term cloud first before, where many of our customers, if at all possible, will leverage cloud assets wherever they can. So the responses here line up pretty well. Okay, so next question. Are you currently using cloud services to create, store, or process like sensitive or protected data, right? EPHI, CUI, NPI, the usual suspects. So not sure, okay. Not sure is probably the most accurate answer, honestly. Oftentimes because of the ease of creating cloud assets, cloud storage, cloud applications, oftentimes your people could be doing something that you aren't even aware of. So I think the not sure is good, but yeah, I think we expected that most of you were already doing this. This is our general understanding of our customers as well. And then for those of you who are not 100% cloud resident, or I guess if you are not resident at all, are your plans to expand into the cloud or to enhance what you're doing there? Or do you feel like part of your business should stay on premises or within your four digital walls, so to speak? Okay, again, I'm not sure. I think that's probably wise. And obviously the cybersecurity aspects of this are one of those considerations. So thank you for this. I think there are no surprises here, and I actually love that some people are saying, not sure at this time. So good on that. Let's get started. So I think to talk about where we're going and the current risks that we see or the current benefits from a security standpoint that we see with cloud services, it's important to talk about where we came from because let's face it, the cloud isn't all that old. Now, I come from a technology background. We were building cloud applications back in 1999, 2000, 2001. We didn't call it the cloud. It was really more software as a service. But at that point, the cloud had sort of been born and the trajectory was already set for the benefits, maybe functional, maybe financial benefits to leveraging the cloud. But if you remember back in 99, 2000, that was really before anyone was talking about information security. We didn't even have the term cybersecurity around. So let's talk real briefly about where we came from and how we got where we are. So if I go back to 2000, 2005 to 2010, most businesses were terrified of the cloud or the internet or software as a service or platform as a service. And I know this because I was a co-founder and chief technology officer for a company, a local company, actually Autotask, that our entire life, the entire service, our entire offering to our customers was software as a service based. All of our data lived in hosted servers, web applications. And even though that cloud, so to speak, was our own. So we rented space at a data center. We built the servers ourselves. We built the networks, the databases, and configured an application to run on the internet. Even this was really before the cloud was really born. But I can tell you that even though we were selling to mostly technical folks, there was a real concern about, I'm not even sure they referred to it as security or risk. There was a real concern about taking stuff that used to run on a server in your closet or your data center in your office and moving it to some other location. And I know people say that the cloud is just another computer, but back then there were concerns about even letting someone else manage or host or operate your own applications, your infrastructure, and other assets. So it was a scary time. Like most people were terrified. And certainly when the conversation about sensitive or protected data came up, it was a total no-go. Like no one was putting medical records out there, PII, Social Security, any other sensitive information. It was just never going to leave. So most organizations, even if they were leveraging software as a service, they still had infrastructure on premises or in their own data centers where they would store the crown jewels. Fast forward to 2010, 2015, 2010 to maybe 2015, 2017 or so, people started to see that the cloud was maturing, that indeed there were ways that it could be more efficient. I wouldn't say often it was more affordable, but perhaps depending on your organization, it made financial sense, whether it was a licensing question or storage or processing or compute. But people started warming up to the idea that, hey, it looks like people have been doing this for a long time now. Maybe this isn't that scary. And so we started dipping our toes in the water, started experimenting. Increasingly, providers were talking about cybersecurity. So whether it was, the early versions of Rackspace or even AWS, which was around really, really early, focusing on cybersecurity was a competitive advantage, and it started creating a sense of calm or peace of mind. And people started coming around to the idea that it was okay to start to put protected assets in the cloud. But since 2017, 2018, we're back here. But it's at the exact opposite. Now, what we find is most companies, certainly the ones that we work with, are terrified to store protected or sensitive data on premises. So we've done a complete 180 in terms of cloud adoption. And I think there's almost at times an irrational exuberance for moving to the cloud. Oh yeah, it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be faster, it's going to be easier, and it can be all of those things. But cybersecurity is still looming. And so the question now becomes, is it secure enough? And we get that question all the time. So cloud adoption today, this is a chart from 2002. I couldn't find anything credible that was newer than that, but I think because everyone just expects that everyone's in the cloud and that this is somewhere between, who knows, 80 and 100% for most organizations. However, despite the adoption, despite the irrational exuberance of cloud adopters, the question does still linger, how safe is the cloud? And we see this all the time. And it did help that organizations like Bank of America, AWS, Sony had major cloud issues where either one, there were disruptions in this service, so they were violating SLAs, or they were just down from a ransomware perspective, right? Talking about third-party risk, where you're leveraging someone else's cloud, all the way to the Bank of America story, where an AWS, we were seeing AWS buckets and virtual machines compromised. Bank of America was one of those. It was a massive breach. They were using a large public cloud, and a whole bunch of financial information was compromised. And so it sort of checked us a bit in that sense, again, coming back to the question, how safe is the cloud? And the answer is, it depends. We're going to talk about all of that right now. So first, I want to go through some myths and some mistakes that people are still making, or that we have experienced over let's say the last 5 years or so in OrbitalFire recent history or so. So first, let's talk about a few of the risks. Now, when we think of risk, we're talking more about business risk today. So this is not so much, are there vulnerabilities in the underlying infrastructure in your public cloud? That's a different story. Let's talk about business risk. The first is visibility. So today, or 20 years ago, when you needed visibility to what was on your server, what applications were running there, what infrastructure was it running on, what version of the operating system, and add another 1,000 characteristics. All you had to do was either ask your IT person or walk into the data closet, fire up the server, and you had all of those answers. You had complete visibility to not only the layers of the operating system or that service that you were using, but everything underneath. Today, the cloud is voodoo. We have no visibility, no understanding of what our cloud service is, and whether you're into platform as a service or software as a service, we have no visibility to what that cloud lives on. We have no visibility to where it lives, right? So we've heard of Patriot Act and other domestic security issues where accidentally or negligently, your data may be stored in Australia or China or somewhere else, but we have no visibility to how these things work. That can create issues if you are assessing risk to the business. Next up, we have very little control. No one here can call Microsoft and say, hey, I need you to downgrade my operating system to this version, or I need you to segregate these networks a specific way. When you're leveraging public cloud, and even to some degree a hybrid cloud, you give up control. Now, the advantage, of course, of giving up that control is that you don't have to do the work, right? And because of that, you actually don't really need the visibility that you used to need to patch or to reconfigure or to upgrade or update. But we relinquish control, which of course creates potential risk if we can't relate those changes and that lack of control to business risk and other technical risks as well. We also have no decision-making authority, right? So Microsoft does what it wants to do. It never asks you, even in your contracts, you have zero leverage in terms of the infrastructure, the cloud itself. You have no authority over that cloud. So if Microsoft decided that it was financially feasible or beneficial for them to host your direct competitor in a virtual machine right next to yours, well, they're going to do that. You have no authority of those types of things. Probably more importantly, you have no authority over the direction of the cloud strategically. So whether it's enabling or disabling certain services, the way it secures your own private or hybrid cloud in the public cloud, you have no authority over any of this. So visibility, control, and authority, these things are all vanishing with the cloud. Now, again, most of us would say, well, that's why I'm in the cloud in the first place, is to get rid of these things. I don't want these responsibilities, or it's not worth it to me. Meaning, I understand the security implications, and I know that there's not all upside. There's some downside to these things, but we have weighed those pros and cons, and we have decided that the cloud makes sense for us, and we are willing to relinquish these responsibilities for the benefits. Now, where it most greatly affects us is around assurance, because as we'll learn, when it comes to the cloud, you are completely dependent on someone else's attestation or statement on the security of your assets. And because we don't have visibility, control, or authority, we have no way to provide those assurances ourselves without relying on someone else's word. And the question then becomes, well, even though it's in this contract, and Microsoft, Google, AWS, Salesforce.com, even though they say that they're managing access controls in a very specific way, the reality is without numbers 1, 2, and 3, I can't prove it myself. I cannot provide assurances to my business. And guess what? That means you cannot provide those assurances to third parties. What we're going to see is that in these cases, your cybersecurity program, where it used to be based on vulnerability scanners and smart people patching, today, all of that is in a contract. So you have taken your security program and moved it from cybersecurity experts and professionals to attorneys, reviewing those and understanding what are the risks in those contracts. I'll talk a little bit more about that because that's going to be a big deal. Now, the implications, right? So those top 4 business risks that we see, the implications of moving to the cloud or leveraging the cloud today, really intensify the more public that your cloud becomes. And then, of course, the implication level goes up. So if you're leveraging AWS in general, or Azure, or Google Cloud, and you're not building your own private cloud there, the closer you get to the public cloud, the harder it is for you to, or perhaps the greater the risk in those 4 areas, right? So for example, software as a service, it's about as public as it gets. So if you're using QuickBooks Online or Facebook for marketing, it's at one end of the spectrum for sure. Now, there are still private clouds available, and that happens too. And we actually see applications being hosted in private clouds to minimize some of these things. But if it's a completely private cloud and you're administering all of that, of course, you have a lot more assurances because you have visibility, control, and authority as it becomes more private. But of course, you're doing more of the work. So just keep in mind that the more public the cloud becomes, the less assurances, the less proof you're able to provide, whether you're going through an assessment, penetration testing, a third-party risk questionnaire. Those things become harder to answer because they're one step removed from your cybersecurity program. Okay, let's jump into a couple of myths and then a few mistakes that we see commonly made. And then we'll get into some of the things that we encourage you to consider as you either continue or start your cloud journey. The first here, this myth, is that my cloud provider is handling our security. I hear this all the time, not necessarily from customers, but from people just having a conversation or prospects of ours where we start talking about, hey, are you in 365 or Google Workspace? Are you leveraging things like Salesforce.com or Dropbox? And then, of course, the next question is, well, what does your current cybersecurity program look like? Well, we used to hear as, oh, my IT guys got this, which of course we knew was not true. But now we hear our cloud providers got this, which we also know is not true. Your cloud providers are likely doing a whole bunch of stuff in cybersecurity. Of course, they are incented to protect your assets. They're also incented to protect their own. There are standards and certifications through the Cloud Security Alliance and other places where, so SOC 2 reports and ISO 27K certifications, where cloud providers continue to pursue because of competitive advantage, right? Their customers are asking for those things. So, and oftentimes cloud providers can be more secure. And the reason is if they're just doing one thing. So for example, let's take Salesforce.com. If all a company is doing is securing CRM data and other data, they're probably going to do a pretty good job at it. At least they would benefit from the focus on those assets. And probably spending millions, tens of millions, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars on cybersecurity like Google has over the past. In fact, many of Google's most recent acquisitions have been in the cybersecurity space. So this is not a privacy conversation, so we're not essentially promoting Google, but I can tell you that when you look at their business plan and what they have done over the last decade or so, cybersecurity has clearly been a priority of theirs. And are they doing cybersecurity better than you can for your browser and other things? I think the answer is probably yes. And that's because that's their focus. That's what they do as a business. They're not providing healthcare services or financial services. They're not manufacturing ball bearings. Security is a core competency for them. But you cannot make the assumption that your cloud provider is just handling your security. Another myth, that your cloud provider is compliant. Very difficult today for cloud providers to demonstrate compliance. Now, as I said, there are certifications out there, particularly the SOC 2 is very, very popular, and there are others. But generally speaking, compliance is not a certifiable state. Many of you know that. Most of you are probably compliance customers of ours. And you have asked us, hey, can I get a badge for my website that says I'm HIPAA compliant, or I'm New York State DFS compliant, or I'm CMMC compliant? And today, the answer is generally no. And so the same thing applies to your cloud provider. Now, it does not mean that they're not compliant either. So while we can't prove a negative, the reality is this has become a challenge for organizations everywhere, because compliance is one of those things that very few people are willing to stick their neck out to say, you are compliant or I am compliant. Because as we know, compliance is a fleeting goal. It's not something that you get and keep. It's something that you constantly pursue, and you can be compliant today and not be compliant tomorrow for many reasons. What are some of the mistakes? In most cases, in nearly every case where you are leveraging cloud assets for critical assets, protected data, other critical services, or your entire infrastructure, keep in mind that generally speaking, other than the desktops and laptops and things that are in your office or in your workforce, all of that security program has been transferred to a piece of paper, a contract, or an agreement, or an attestation. Very similar to the way most of you are being scrutinized by your customers, right? Your best customer sends you a 200-point questionnaire about your cybersecurity program. They kind of have to take your word for it. And in your contract with them is where enforcement takes place. So what does this mean? It means that you have to be good at translating cybersecurity concepts from technical jargon, things like, password hashes and encryption to a contract that talks about how are you protecting my data. This leap has been a difficult one for most small businesses because they don't have armies of attorneys and they can't afford to scrutinize every single contract, every SLA, and maybe they don't understand it to begin with, right? So we're in a situation now where the legal aspects of cybersecurity have become more important, not just for responding to incidents, but of course for evaluating those contracts, understanding where there may have been a violation or like an SLA violation or something like that, all the way to disaster recovery, right? So if a third party of yours is down for a week or two, that all becomes cybersecurity risk for you, and of course you pass those risks on to your customers. So keep in mind that today, for your cloud providers, the cybersecurity program that you depend on and that you are probably reporting on in most cases is really comes down to a contract. And how well or how good is that contract is the question. Incident response becomes problematic as well. So 10 years ago, roughly, maybe a little more, if an incident occurred at your organization, whether it was ransomware or a bunch of money missing from a payroll account, you hired experts. They would come in, they would do an investigation, forensic analysis, whatever was necessary. And part of that was going through and recreating the crime scene, right? That's what forensics is really about. So looking through log files, looking through the other breadcrumbs that a cyber criminal may have left, looking at firewall rules, right? What happened? What traffic was going in and out at the time of the incident, right? And there's 1,000 other things. Now today, incident response, especially if it affects your cloud assets and some of that confidential, protected, sensitive data has been impacted, guess what? You don't own the logs. You don't own the firewall. You don't own any of that. And so there's, generally speaking, no recourse or no way for you to conduct that forensic investigation. Now, you would still go about it similarly for the assets that are on premises, laptops, maybe an office resident firewall, things like that. But for those of you who said we're 100% in the cloud, guess what? You generally are not going to own any of those logs, which means that you're going to need to make legal requests for that information, and it's not always available. So even with an attorney who understands how to work with Amazon or Google, guess what? You may never get that information because those logs are commingled with millions of other customers. And so it's not easy for these cloud providers to tease out or distinguish between your data or your log information, your forensics, and someone else's. Now, this becomes problematic because in most cases, if you are going through an incident and you may have, let's say, controlled unclassified information, if you're in the DoD manufacturing supply chain, or you're in healthcare, or you are a financial services provider, or you're providing payroll services, or you or a mortgage attorney, that information and a clear, confident conclusion on whether or not that information has been compromised is somewhat out of your reach at times. This now disrupts your ability to do the mandatory reporting, and regardless of what industry and what regulatory agency is providing governance and scrutiny, it's going to be much more difficult now to say, was my data breached or not? Keep in mind, once you declare a breach, that's when the real headaches start. And I've talked with this with most of you probably. But that breach declaration is always one of the pinnacle moments of an investigation, an incident response scenario. Many of you have domestication requirements and probably from your customers. So again, this is a big requirement for those of you who are manufacturers who may be working with federal agencies or with the DoD and the US military. there are requirements that your data be hosted here domestically. This started back with the Bush era, and the Patriot Act, when we started doing surveillance and figured out that, hey, a lot of these cloud providers or software as a service providers were using storage in other countries because it was far more inexpensive and really didn't have an impact on performance. And so whether it's in Ireland, a very common, or Australia or China, you should not, unless you have been very specific and probably paid a serious premium for domesticating your data, there's a good chance that your data is in a country that is not your own. And so again, coming back to that contract, the requirements, and some of the different licensing levels, obviously Microsoft has a service level for Office 365 called Government Cloud, and different levels of the Government Cloud, all of which are far more expensive than what you're paying for like a business premium or an E3 license today. But you should not assume that your data is here in the States. It's really easy to make the mistake that if you move the data from your data, closet that's in, Albany, New York, and you put it in the cloud, it's very easy to just assume that your data is still in Albany. But of course, thinking about it critically, we all know that it's not. So understand what your domestication and data requirements are for your industry, also your contracts. Don't forget, everyone else's China or cybersecurity program has moved to a contract too. So make sure you understand what your contractual obligations are, because you may have a customer that says, hey, if you want us to work with you, you're going to guarantee us that our data does not leave the United States. It's happening all the time. Okay, so most cloud providers make pretty big claims, provide guarantees in some way, service level agreements, and they say, hey, listen, if X happens to your data, we agree that we will be partially or even completely accountable for dealing with the repercussions. The issue now becomes, let's say they're doing that perfectly, and that every one of you that are here today, that all of your data is 100% compliant, secured in a compliant way, and secure, meaning invulnerable. Now, the question becomes, of course, back to visibility, to control, to authority, is who's protecting the cloud? Who's protecting Google today? The simple answer is Google is protecting Google, but Google themselves have had problems, as have Microsoft and virtually every other cloud provider out there. So if the cloud infrastructure that your cloud lives on top of is compromised, which is what happened with Amazon, right? So it was an AWS misconfiguration that essentially made thousands, millions of S3 buckets and other virtual machines vulnerable. And in those cases, it wasn't the clouds that you put there. It was the underlying infrastructure. And so who's protecting the cloud? Well, that's a good question. There's not a lot of oversight today. And I think that's changing. And certainly we are starting to see more standardization, certifications for cloud security, and as well as cloud providers. But the reality is that this is not a heavily regulated part of the solution. So even though you may have HIPAA requirements, it's possible that your cloud provider isn't living up to the same standard. Now, let's hope that if they have essentially obligated themselves to it or committed to that or told you that they're indeed doing these things. But of course, as we know, there are no guarantees in cybersecurity. So even if you do everything you need to in your contracts, your security program, your settings for your cloud services and applications, the possibility that your data is still compromised or becomes unavailable is still out there, because the cloud itself is just someone else's computer. And we all know that every computer is vulnerable. Okay, I want to give you some trips. Let's hope they're not trips, but I guess trips and ticks for securing your cloud environments. And then we'll move into some final thoughts and some questions. First of all, I think this is becoming less true, but this has been a tip that we have been handing out for 5 years, which is don't adopt the cloud. Don't move to the cloud just for security purposes, either to avoid it or to embrace it. Because most of what you're going to do in terms of security in the cloud is either a configuration, a setting, a license level, selecting an application, selecting the right provider, reviewing and maturing your contracts, and then monitoring for SLAs and other problems, most of which have very little to do with security. The reality is the cloud is no more or less secure than a computer sitting in your data closet. What's really important is what you do about it. And so while many, I'll say most people were hoping to wash their hands of cybersecurity just by putting their stuff in the cloud, that's not how this works. And we have seen some real problems with organizations who have drawn those conclusions and made that assumption. Your cybersecurity program, the controls that make up your program, the compliance obligations or mandates that are being enforced in your industry, the contracts and the other contractual and legal obligations, they're not changing, which means you have to either understand how to implement encryption, or you need to understand how to attest to or provide evidence of encryption working in your environment. In the first case, you have complete visibility, control, and authority over it because it's a server in your closet. In the next case, in the cloud case, you're going to be looking through contracts, or you're going to be requiring SOC 2 certifications or reports, or you're going to be going through other cloud provider security attestations and asking for evidence because you're still required to do all of that. So generally speaking, your security program doesn't change. The requirements don't change. It's just that where you are going for evidence and assurances is going to change from a vulnerability scanner to a contract. Another issue here is assuming that the controls are transferable. So for example, in on a server in your closet, you can do something called configuration management, which is essentially you define what is that hardened security configuration that you want present on your server. Then you can scan for those configurations and identify what we call configuration drift. Now, that's kind of a busy process, but critically present in almost every cybersecurity framework, best practice, regulatory mandate. Configuration management is just standard part of cybersecurity. However, when you move to the cloud, those configuration management items may change drastically. Again, you may not have visibility and probably don't have visibility, control, or authority over the actual configurations themselves. Think of locking screensaver. Today, on a Windows laptop, you can go and change that setting directly. You see it, you've got evidence, you've got control and authority over that. But if you are delivering a desktop from a virtual machine in the cloud, you may not have access to that. And so how do we now, in this lack of transferability, how do we compensate for those perceived deficiencies, right? If I can't do configuration management the way I'm used to, how do I ensure that the infrastructure is applying or aligning with those best practices, the security, the hardened baselines and benchmarks? They're not always transferable. You may have to rethink and compensate for the things that you can no longer do in order for you to provide assurances to your customers, right? And your contractual adherence and obligations. That's going to be an important part of this. So there's not always a one-to-one transference of those security controls and concepts and processes. Going back to incident response or performance, availability, the things that you may be providing or promising to your customers, the The reality is today you still cannot outsource liability. If your data, let's call it your EPHI, your medical records, your health information, if you have decided through due diligence and screening cloud providers that you're going to put all of your health information into the cloud, and that may be like an EMR, a medical record system, or it may just be other data living in Google Drive. If you've decided that that's okay, if that data is compromised, no matter how it's compromised, either negligence or an accident on your company's part directly, or it's Google and an error at Google, guess what? Your customers don't care where your data or where the data that you have taken custody of is stored, created, processed, transmitted. It's your job to protect it regardless of where and how you're using the cloud. Now, this creates an issue because you are now leaning on those contracts, service level agreements, and other guarantees and promises that your cloud provider has made to you around responding to incidents or breach of confidential information. You can't outsource liability. The best you can probably do is transfer some of that risk to an insurance policy. But even with that, not having visibility becomes a challenge, right? So we're changing our thinking in terms of cloud security, but just know that putting your stuff in the cloud does not mean that Google or Amazon are responsible for it. They are not. You are, and you cannot get rid of that liability. And this, I'm speaking of the data that you take custody of or have access to on behalf of your customers. When thinking about your program, your cybersecurity program, most of you have seen this slide, but I'm going to repeat it real quickly here again because it's relevant here. When building a program, there's really three places to start. The first is what you should do, right? And what you should do comes from an effective risk assessment. For most of you, we are doing that risk assessment for you every year. The advantage of risk assessment, of course, are it's very precise and it's very accurate if you can do it. The disadvantage is it can be very time consuming. And if you're going to do a quantitative risk assessment, it can also be very expensive. The next is what you must do, right? This comes from compliance, the HIPAA security rule, New York State DFS 500, the SEC, CMMC level 2, right? The mandates that come from a third party, typically a federal or state government agency, that say you're going to do 1 through 10. You must do those things. Now, the advantage of this is now we have a prescription, know exactly what we need to do. The disadvantage, of course, is being compliant doesn't necessarily mean you're secure. I think we've all learned that. And then the third, of course, which is, I think, unfortunately today where most small businesses live is, hey, what can I do? So this is looking at, what are the things that we have been doing for years that we're pretty good at or we understand. Some people call it low-hanging fruit, but essentially this is a capability model. And the advantage, of course, is you're comfortable doing this. You can afford it. You know how to. You've got the expertise. The disadvantage of the capability approach is that it may not address your risk and it may not address your compliance. Now, of course, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. From a cloud perspective, let me just throw this back up. From a cloud perspective, you're going to do the same things, right? How well does my cloud provider help me assess and manage risk? How well does a cloud provider help me comply with my regulatory and commercial mandates, whether it's PCI or FTC safeguards, if you're an auto dealer? How well does it help me there? And then, of course, how accessible is it to me? Do I trust this cloud provider? Can I afford it? Do they make incident response information available to me if I really need it? You're still going to go through the same program architectural decisions if you're largely cloud resident. And this process stays largely the same. Something we speak about all the time is the two primary goals. Another advantage or another guiding principle here is that our goals in cybersecurity do not change, right? Everyone probably has heard me say this on one or more occasions. We're going to focus on defensibility right? Which is we're going to do enough of the right things in the right order so that if anyone else asks about our cybersecurity program, and that could be your board, your customers, a regulatory authority, that we have done enough of those things in the right order that it satisfies their scrutiny, right? That's defensibility. We're in a defensible position with our cybersecurity program. The same is going to apply if you're leveraging the cloud. Similarly, with resilience, we want to minimize things like downtime and disruption and regulatory penalties or reputational issues. So as you're doing your due diligence on your cloud providers and considering moving critical assets or protected data to a cloud, then you need to be really focused on these two things. How does that cloud migration, that cloud provider, the service, how does it affect my defensibility? How does it affect my resilience? Critical questions here that you need to be asking yourself. And all of you out there are using different, providers for this, as do we, honestly. And so it's just one of those routine things that we need to stay focused on because it's real easy to get lost in the weeds in cybersecurity. A couple of final thoughts, and then I'll take whatever questions. So please throw them in the chat, the Q&A, whatever's easiest for you. We increasingly are seeing that the vast majority of our customers are almost entirely or entirely cloud first and cloud resident. Keep in mind that our services work identically, regardless of whether you've got a server in your data closet or you're entirely cloud-based. The things that we do, whether it's penetration testing or vulnerability management or training for your workforce or risk assessments, for us, the outcomes that you experience from us are identical. And so we generally have no strong preference in terms of where you are and how much you're leveraging the cloud. It should really be a business decision. And our job, of course, is to help protect you no matter what you decide, right? In many ways, we're the Secret Service, which is, hey, president's going to drop into a combat theater on Christmas Eve. Well, as the Secret Service, we don't like that. We don't want you to do that. But at some point, the president's got to do their job. And so it's our responsibility and accountability now to protect you no matter what you decide. Of course, we're going to have recommendations. Some of them we may strongly encourage you to do or not do something that's relative to cloud security. But ultimately, the decision is yours, and we're going to do our best to protect you no matter what it is that you decide. Now, there are going to be cases, and we have seen 2024 was the year of the third-party incident, the third-party breach. And that, I hope for all of you, was sort of a beacon of what's to come. Because as we continue to lean on third parties for more and more of our cybersecurity program, our program doesn't change, and the way we pursue it may change a little bit, but ultimately our visibility, the control and the authority we have over some of these things starts to wane. With that, I will take any questions that have percolated up. We're not going to put anyone on the spot here today. If you don't have questions, you can always reach us here. My email address, just reg@orbitalfire.com. So if something comes up afterward, or you're sharing this with a comrade and they have questions, please make sure they're asking. We'll do whatever we can to get you good answers. But Dana, I'll turn it back to you for closing comments and to see if there's any questions.
Yeah. So far, it looks like there's no questions. You've given everybody, I'm sure, a lot to think about. And I'll just echo what Reg said, for sure, reach out to him or to support@orbitalfire.com so you can speak to your customer success manager if you do want to talk more about your cloud strategy. And other than that, we really look forward to seeing you at these next events. We do these to make sure that we continue to give you the education and the information you need to make good decisions. So if you ever have ideas or thoughts about what you'd like to see, please let me know, Dana@orbitalfire.com, or talk to your customer success manager, because we are always open and love to get your feedback. So with that, I still don't see questions. Reg, I think I should just say thank you.
Yeah, nothing to do but say thank you and have a great day. Enjoy the sunshine if you're local here to the Troy area. And we look forward to seeing all of you.
Thanks, everyone.